Good afternoon. Welcome back to 4:30 at the Craft Mastery Summit. I'm going to be kicking off the evening session, and I want to share a little conversation with you about the power of the first draft. Can you see my green bar? Can you hear me? Anyway, so I'm going to share with you a little conversation about the power of the first draft. Now, I don't know if anybody who really remembers who Ernest Hemingway is, but I fancy myself a little bit of a reader, and I really like Hemingway's writings. It's really strong, powerful writing. Ernest Hemingway said that the first draft of anything is shit. And that's a pretty profound statement. But when you marinate through it and you start to realize the relevance of that, I think you can start to pick it apart a little bit. Like, I look back and I remember my first job at the Ritz-Carlton in Dearborn, Michigan. And I remember the first time that I made French onion soup. I spent the great majority of my day peeling onions. I think it was 3 cases of onions. So literally it was like the full 8-hour day peeling onions, slicing, reslicing, because I think my first maybe half a case I cut wrong. Really, I didn't realize that there was a right and a wrong way to cut an onion, but eventually I worked that out. I got that quote unquote right. And I made this dark, beautiful onion soup. It was dark, it was caramelized. It was what I thought was perfect. It had a funny smell to it though, and it turns out that the thing was burnt. And I'm not talking about like kind of burnt. I'm talking about absolutely no part of this soup was not burnt. We're not talking about deep caramelization. We're talking about black carbonization. It was awful, repulsively so. And I really think that, at this point in my life, I know that was a lesson. I know that there was quite a bit of a lesson there because they didn't even give me chicken stock to work with. But looking back as when I was 17 years old, when I first started working at the Ritz-Carlton, I look back and I had a little bit of an ego. I thought I knew a little bit about something, and I really thought that I was coming to show them what I knew. At the same time, I was really humble at the fact that I was at the Ritz-Carlton, and I was really excited to make French onion soup for the first time. That was pretty amazing and pretty cool, and it was entirely soul-crushing at the same time. I mean, I was absolutely crushed. I was absolutely broken-hearted, and it tore me up for a while. Now, I guess you could fast forward a little bit, and there's kind of commonalities throughout my life, and I remember another maybe 10 years after that. Let's see, 2005, 6, or 7, I was working for Master Chef Andrini, and I needed to overnight the prime ribs. We had a process, we had done prime ribs, and we were getting ready for a Friday night service, so it was Thursday night. We were going to overnight these ribs. I had 5 of them. I didn't do that right either. That was a mess, and the executive sous chef who kind of had it out for me, he basked in the glory of my mistake and totally enjoyed the fact that I absolutely did not get it right. Again, I was crushed. But it was a relevant lesson, and if you back out a little bit, realizing it was the first time, it wasn't really that far of a stretch to imagine that could happen. As chefs, we tend to be really, really hard on ourselves, and especially when it comes to failure. None of us like to fail. We all care, and we all try so very hard to overcome that failure. Maybe as a fear of the pain, or maybe as an avoidance of the pain, or getting yelled at, whatever it may be. But we develop this kind of hardened resistance to failing, forgetting entirely the fact that, it's really important to have those first failings. It's really important to have those first drafts, those first mistakes, those things that really, really epically shake us to the core. after the prime ribs, I managed to avoid major catastrophe for the next, 10 years or so until I was in my mid-30s. And, at that point in my career, I was pretty much coasting. I was on, in a pretty normal place. I knew what not to do. I had an idea of what to do for my level of understanding. But then something shook that whole thing up. I started working towards preparing for Chef of the Year and for the Bocuse d'Or Team USA. And my old friend, Mr. Failure, came back. My feeling of awfulness, of that gross feeling of feeling like I was inadequate, like I couldn't do anything right, and just feeling an absolute sense of failure just started to overwhelm me a bit again. And so I fell on my face dramatically at the Bocuse d'Or Team USA tryouts, in 2015. I was trying out for the 2017 team. And for the next 6 months, I kind of dealt with some really significant internal self-abuse. I was really very hard on myself. What I had yet to realize, and I wasn't far from it at this point, was that life is all about process. And no matter what, everything starts with little steps. These little things that pop up, that crop up every now and again. See, there's a natural flow to things. At first you don't see it, at least not until you climb up a little bit higher. I guess it's like hiking or mountain climbing. You can't really see the path below until you're up at a higher elevation. And it's the same thing once you make some accomplishment in your career. You can't really see your path. You can't really see what made the biggest difference until you get a little higher up, right? But after you do get a little higher up, everything starts to make a bit of sense. You start to see things clearly. You can see that path laid out, and it either comes from reflecting and looking back, or it comes from recognizing what maybe you're doing wrong. For anybody who doesn't know, I'm Gerald Ford, hosting the Craft Mastery Summit, and I'm here as a guide for chefs who are in search of your next evolution. And today I want to make sure that I spend, the better part of the next 75 minutes, maybe hour, not quite an hour and a half, sharing some things I learned along my path about that first draft, about how to get there, how to get the most out of it, and remembering that there's actually a lot of power in getting out of your comfort zone, screwing things up for the first time like you've never done it before, and moving on. I think that ties really nicely into the mindset of mastery, the value of process. And so what I encourage you is that if you want to save 5 or 15 years of your life from figuring things out the hard way, I invite you to stay and listen. A lot of these lessons came about as a result of my spending time with Master Chef Andrini, with Ken Arnone, going to Rich Rosendale's classes, working with Chef Sean Loving, talking to Ferdinand Metz, doing everything humanly possible to learn as much as I could. Along the way, I learned a lot of things that I wanted to copy, and I learned a lot of things that I absolutely, positively did not want to replicate. But at least I learned that there were things that I wanted to do, and there were a grand number of things that I absolutely did not want to do. And it was those lessons that really stood out to me. The number one lesson from that being that there's something to learn in everything along the process. Good, bad, or whatever, there's a lesson in everything. And just like in The Power of the First Draft, everything has to start somewhere. See, that first draft is a first iteration. And if you're not familiar with the word iteration, it's not meant to sound complicated. I just like the word. Iteration is a first existence. It is that first draft. But iteration in and of itself allows you to understand that there are versions that come after. Knowing that it's not one lone failure, it's not one lone step in a series, it's simply the beginning of a process. So when you start to iterate, you can take that first draft automatically knowing And for me, accepting that it's garbage and knowing that I can turn it into the next thing, creation, another idea. And like I said, everything has to start somewhere. So let's call that first iteration a first draft. There's the reality that that is likely to be shit, like Hemingway said. If you do a little bit of research on Hemingway, you'll figure out that he wrote a lot. But before he wrote stuff that the world read, that made a difference in people's lives, he wrote a lot of garbage. He threw a lot away. We're talking about one of the foremost experts in literature and one of the most moving writers of the late 1800s. And he changed people's lives. Accepting, though, that that first draft was just awful. So understand and grasp that there's just raw power in that first draft. Bringing that idea into a reality. Bringing that out to the surface. I look back at preparing for Team USA. And quite honestly, when I was preparing for Team USA, I wasn't in the same spot as I was earlier on in my career. You're trying out for Team USA. I was the executive sous chef at the Everglades Club. I had some competitions behind me. I was getting ready to I was preparing for the Master Chef exam. Kind of, in my head at least, felt like I had something to lose. It's kind of a dangerous place to be in. There's a lot of power in kind of having nothing to lose. I didn't want to go to Team USA tryouts and look like a fool. I didn't want to go and put up terrible food. You're going to hear Chef Metz talk later about the courage that needs to happen in order to take the risk and really bring that risk out and show up to these things, to push yourself, to push those limits. And quite honestly, it was a risk that I maybe didn't grasp in its entirety at the time. But I didn't have that ignorance that I had earlier on in my career when I didn't know any better, when I was just trying things because I had no other baseline to compare them to. But now fast forward in 2017, when I was trying out for Team USA, I had some successes under my belt. I had people who looked at me as somebody who knew what they were doing, and people had an expectation of me. When you have nothing to lose, it's easy to make big moves. But what's important to remember is that at any point in your life, you can make big moves. Don't get hung up on that. More on that later, but let's get back to this first draft. It's important to remember that you can always go back to that first draft mentality in knowing that you have to get something done the first time. So here I am getting ready for Team USA tryouts. I'm trying to write this menu for a cold food platter, and I kept getting stuck. At the idea of perfection, the idea of I need to make this perfect before I ever even get started, which is stupid, but at the same time, it made sense to me for whatever reason that is, right? I didn't want to risk looking like an idiot is really what it came down to. And all of a sudden, I had this little tick in the back of my mind reminding me of a conversation that I had with Ken Arnone almost literally 17 years earlier. And he was constantly nudging me to get the first one done. To stop thinking, just get it done. Stop trying to plan, just get it done. Do the thing. Stop trying to make it perfect, just do the thing. That's what was playing on in my head. And I'm so glad that I had that conversation at an earlier point in my career because, quite honestly, I was stuck. Have you gotten stuck on perfection before? If you have, let me know in the chat. I would love to hear about it because I think we all get stuck, especially when we're in a situation where we're risking what we think is our reputation. Where quite honestly, it's what's good for us. Getting out there, getting that first draft done, putting what we know to the test and trying to see how far that can go. That's really relevant. There's a lot of lessons in that, and that's really how you can find expansion. And that's another part of why mentors are such a critical part of success and of process along the way. Life is short. time for learning is limited. Time for creativity is pretty limited. So, it's to your benefit to have great mentors who have been where you want to go, who can kind of help you find a path forward. In the beginning, I sort of felt like, Master Chef Arnone was kind of picking at me a little bit, but I know he wasn't. He was really, quite honestly, matter-of-factly almost, just telling me to get started. I was trying to write menus. I was trying to draw pictures. I was trying to find the perfect recipes. I was doing everything but creating the first version of something. Instead of just cooking a dish, which I had done many times before, I was doing everything other than the small, simple thing that I needed to do. That little thing that would have made the world of difference. And he was really just trying to nudge me out of that place of like, look, get out of the office. Quit studying, quit research, and just go cook it. And that is what finally twisted and allowed me to make that first step. That first draft is really that first step along that process. And until you have a first draft, you have no baseline. So fast forward back 15 years later, it's 2017. I'm getting ready to, prepare. I'm in the process of preparing for tryouts for Team USA. And it was pretty much the same conversation, except playing out in my head yet again. I was hung up on getting the menu just right, being worried about the risk and being worried about looking like a fool. And everything that I was putting on this menu, I had cooked before, except I was holding myself back from fear of looking like a fool. Now, this was a cold food platter. I'd never put one up for national team tryouts. So obviously there was that. I'd put up cold food platters before, but none of them like this. Our brains sometimes do terrible things to us because, we think about things in the worst ways sometimes. Sometimes our brain is like, yeah, you may have done a cold food platter, but you've never done it for the national team. Or, yeah, you've cooked this food before, but now you're doing it for Thomas Keller. And quite honestly, we all fall victim of that if we let that happen. Practice and preparation and, getting started can help us work through that, but you have to work around that. Know that we all deal with it, know that we all recognize that it's there, and the key is to really just do the work. Get through that first draft, create that first baseline. And so I can tell you that I always have that voice in the back of my head now saying, get it done, get the first one done, just get it done. That's all you need to do is get the first version up. Because once the first version's up, then you have a baseline and a starting point. You can evaluate where you're at. You can evaluate where everything else is going to start from. And that's really what's going to help you the most get started. Not sitting in the office, not, thinking through what needs to happen, what needs to work. You need to get started. Success is going to require two major things: knowing where you are and knowing where you want to go. And the work that you're going to have to do is the difference between the two. Once you create that first draft, you now have your baseline for where you're at. Regardless of what level you are as a cook, as a chef, as a culinarian, as a craftsman, as a master of the craft, you have your starting point. It's always individual. Then once you have a destination for where you want to go, you can plug in the work that you need to do. If you can't do that on your own, then that's what mentors are for. That's what coaches are for. That's what we're here for, to help move that bar, to help move that needle. That's the work that you're going to have to do in order to get there. That first draft has all the power of creating a clear picture of your starting point. Very often, once I get on a path, I try and fail as quickly as I can, as early as humanly possible. Those micro failures are what really prevent macro failures on the major level. right? Doing things to push myself and test myself on the smaller scale prevent me from getting to the show and falling short. Cooking for Ken Arnone in my kitchen, components before building a dish helped me understand what components were going to go on a dish best the first time around. That way when I put up a dish, the dish was more successful already. And then doing that for another evaluator, cooking a dish for Chef Scannell or Chef Scott, all of those things help prepare me for the work that I needed to do later in order to be successful. Taking pictures of the platter as I was building it, sending them to Ken Arnone, sending them to Master Chef Andrini, sending them to, I had the good fortune of working with Chef Drew Garms or Joe Albertelli. Sending them to those people helped me fail small. So that way when I went to tryouts, I didn't fail at all. If I fell short a little bit, I fell short, but at least I put the effort in on the micro scale. So those little failures really prevented any macro large scale failure. People talk about preparing for the Master Chef exam, and I'm really encouraged cooking for a Master Chef a couple of times before going to the test, because nothing feels quite like cooking in that environment, like cooking in that environment. There's no way to really mimic that. And if you haven't felt it, it's hard to feel that for the first time at the test. Consider that another version of that first draft. And one of the things that it is so easy to forget, but so relevant to remember, is that it is okay to suck when you start off doing something different, when you do something new. Usually when you're new at something, you're not very good at it. It's cool. Don't take it personally. Move on. It's okay to suck. Fix it. Do the work to get better. What you produce in the beginning is likely to suck, and it should, because if you've never done the thing before, how can you know how to do it? So don't waste your time trying to get everything worked out before you've done the work and you've learned the lessons. I think this is something that some of the newer generation of cooks really struggles with, is they want to be really good at something that they've never really done, forgetting that this is a craft. And there's a lot that we do on the day-to-day that you just can't learn without putting your hands to food, without crafting food, without cooking food, without really making flavorful stuff. Key lesson to take away here is start sooner. The sooner you start, the sooner you can move your way forward. It's those little failures happening in the beginning that prevent the larger failures on the end. So remember, just get the first one done. And that's exactly what I started to hear in my head every time I got stuck on that first draft. Every time I started holding myself back and saying, I need to make this perfect, I need to make this as great as I possibly can on the first time. It's never gonna happen. Perfection is never found in that first draft. And so whatever voice it is that you need to hear in your head that will help remind you that it's okay for the first draft to be a little gnarly, and whatever you need to do to get it up is what I would encourage you to do. So in the end, I pulled up my cold food platter, I got it up for tryouts, I got really put a ton of work into it, and I developed that path after that first draft was done. So remember that there's no way to find perfection early on. There's a piece here that I think really needs to be relayed to newer generations of cooks as they're coming into the field. You see a lot of great chefs on Instagram, you see a lot of bad chefs on Instagram too, but you see a lot of great chefs, and there's a lot of great food, there's a lot of great cooking. It's easy to miss the fact that a lot of these people have spent years at the stove. They've spent years at the craft. And it's so important to make sure that we relay that information, that it takes time. It takes time to develop the skills. Now, I look at all the years I lost wasting my time worrying about my failures or trying to prolong the pain of getting that first draft done. Quite honestly, I didn't hear that quote from Hemingway until I was in my 30s, but I wish I'd found it 10 years earlier. It would have made a complete difference in my life, in my work, in the way that I approached everything over those years. I feel like there's a decade there where I probably could have made massive progress if I had been willing to just try something new. You know, there's often that time when you think people are watching you and they're really being critical of you and they're really not paying any attention to you. If you sit back and you really keep going, there's a lot of people who really just aren't paying any attention to you, even though you may think that they are. So if that's something that may be holding you back from getting whatever your first draft is that you need to do, whatever that first draft is for you, for your next evolution, just realize they're probably not paying that much attention. And if they are, well, maybe they're just being critical because they're jealous. So make that leap. Start skipping over the idea of trying to make things perfect before you even start. And I'll tell you, for me, that would have made so much difference that I know I would have tried more. I know I would have stretched further. I would have been more willing to contribute, more willing to fail, and I would have definitely had a chance to go to France to compete in the Bocuse d'Or at some point, because I would have tried earlier. I would have failed sooner. Now, what really ends up happening in that first version, like I said, isn't going to get you where you need to go. Do what you can to use that as a starting point to propel yourself forward. Looking back, yet again, I think of my time in high school that I wasted, thinking about how I really wanted to be a great writer, and it was unrealistic. I had never written before, so I never had a chance to become one. I never put in my reps. I never spent my time doing the work, and there's no substitute for doing the work. Apply that same philosophy here. Don't come to a certification exam with something you've never done before, right? Or something that you've done once or twice. Come with proficiency. Come with the work having been done. And recognize that we all know what it means to have to do that first version, but make sure that it's been iterated to the point where it's really well understood, it's really well executed, and it's something that you're proud of. There's a massive benefit when you know that that first draft is gonna suck. Just write it off. Know that that's gonna happen. Prepare as much as humanly possible for that first go, but don't waste your time. Get it done, know it's gonna suck, and know you're gonna make a second draft. When you think of that first draft as an iteration and know that there's gonna be a draft 2, you're already thinking about making it better. The third's gonna be better. The fourth is gonna be better. If you're like most chefs, if you're like any chef that I know that I've come in interaction with, you're probably in a pursuit of perfection anyway. So it's something that you're going to continually reiterate on. Just make sure that you're doing work, not waiting to be perfect. Perfection, or the pursuit of perfection, excellence can come from work and rework. Trying to plan something to perfection is an absolute waste of time. It's never going to get anything done. The first draft is that most powerful step down the path of execution, because everything has to start somewhere. And it's all in what you do from that point. Now, I like to talk about iteration a little bit, and I think it's important to discuss the process that goes into taking that first draft and turning it into something else. Excuse me. You see, I said it all starts with that first draft, that first iteration. But once that first iteration is done, then you need to move it through some steps in order to make the next iteration even better. Now, if you drop your first draft and you find that it's not exactly what you expect and you already know what you want to do for the next draft, then go for it. At some point, though, you're going to be limited by what you know. So what I always encourage is going after that iteration and getting some feedback from people who understand. Now, I would call them an expert, and I know that that's a word that's thrown around quite a bit, but I would go to somebody who understands the thing. Now, when it comes to cold food, I reach out to Russell Scott, I reach out to Ken Arnone, I have relationships with them. There are phenomenal cold food chefs all over the country. So when I put up my first platter, I could have evolved it to the next iteration, but it would have taken me a lot longer if I didn't send those pictures or those recipes or my techniques to those two professional chefs, those two master chefs, and gotten their feedback. Then once you get that feedback, you need to be able to filter out what that is to you, what they tell you, what you're going to incorporate, right? So you present something to your professional chefs, you present something to your group for feedback. They give you feedback, they give you information. Now it's your responsibility to figure out what exactly they're communicating with you and filter that. Filter that in a way that works for you so that not only are you hearing it, but you can absolutely implement it. Right now, filter. I mean, I think it's important for us all to make sure that we have certain standards in our life, that we have filters in place to make sure that the information that we're hearing really falls on us in a way that's necessary to us. But not all information from all sources is entirely relevant. I use the word filter. If you think of filter as like a chinois, think of it as a chinois for your life, or think of it as a chinois for that feedback. For example, one of my filters, I have a rule that I won't take advice from somebody that I wouldn't switch places with, which is why I make sure that the people that I'm talking about cold food with have cold food experience, have cold food expertise, have information. Now, if I wanted to dive down a path and get a little more modern with modern cooking techniques, I would incorporate probably Rich Rosendale. I'd reach out and maybe talk to some of my other chef friends that I've worked with that have a really solid grasp of modern cooking, be it modern hydrocolloid use or be it modern plating, whatever that may be. But I never take advice from somebody that I wouldn't switch places with. I love my brother dearly. But I'm probably not going to ask him how to plate a cold food platter for a buffet in Germany. You want to be conscious of that because there's lots of people who will give you feedback that may not necessarily fall in line with what you're trying to accomplish. As we get older, we tend to realize that not everybody can help us in the way that we need. When you're younger, you need to be careful about who you're taking advice from. So that idea of not taking advice from somebody that you wouldn't switch places with can serve you well for sure, right? I'm not going to take advice from a friend who is terrible in relationships when it comes to, my relationship with my wife. It's probably not going to help my marriage last. Again, would I switch places with them? Another one, right? If you dream of opening a restaurant, don't ask people who've never opened a restaurant before. There's a ton of people who have an opinion about opening a restaurant, but really have no idea what that's all about. Talk to people who failed in restaurant openings. Talk to people who've succeeded in opening. But remember and be conscious of the fact that there's a lot of people who will tell you not to open a restaurant who've never had the audacity to give it a go. Don't let somebody else's limitations limit you. Filter who gives you your feedback. Make sure that the people that you're seeking out have experience that they can lend you that you can learn from. Not necessarily that you agree with, but that you can learn from. I mean, I quite honestly, at this point in my career, I seek out people who will shoot holes in my ideas. It doesn't stop me from doing the things that I want to do. It just helps me ensure that what it is that I'm doing is bulletproof or more bulletproof, or it allows me to prepare for those shots that somebody might take, right? Got to make sure that there's facts backing up that information. So I apologize for getting stuck on the filter, but I think it's really important to remember that who gives you information will have an impact on you, your development, and the development of your food. So if we're talking about development of a cold food platter, let's go back to that analogy. Make sure they have relevant experience with that. There's tons of people who haven't done something that say that you can't do it either. Not true. Grew up, well, I'll tell you my story. I grew up in Dearborn here in a minute. There's a lot of people who haven't done something, so they believe that you can't do something, and that's just quite honestly not true. Don't let somebody else's, hesitations get in the way of your decisions. Make sure you filter that stuff out. Now, don't let it get in the way of your decision making. Don't let it get in the way of your execution. Don't let it get in the way of your evolution. Whatever version that comes next from you is entirely up to you. So after you get that feedback and you filter it, you need to implement those changes that come, and then you should reflect and see what's working and what's not. Then you can go back into a whole revision and a new iteration. First draft is really where it all starts. We headed down a couple rabbit holes there. So just to pull the whole thing back together, the first draft is your first iteration. Don't be shy about seeking feedback to make sure that you can take that to the next level. Filter that information to make sure it suits your purpose. Implement those changes that you get. Reflect and make sure that those changes work. Revise to make sure that you're leveling up, and then reiterate, you're at your next level. And that's how you take that first draft and you spin it off into something else. Now, I mentioned that I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan. I grew up a pretty normal kid, a child of divorced parents, working class family. My dad's a fireman. Well, he was a fireman. He retired as the chief of the fire department. My mom, a daycare provider. And I grew up with some really cool family traditional food. German-Polish background for the most part. There's a lot of other things in there, but that was kind of the food that I grew up with. And then I had the cool opportunity. I had some really unique experience because my uncle would take me to these markets. He'd take me to, the Mexican market to see masa being ground and then made into handmade tortillas. And we would go into the Asian market and to find food that was authentic as humanly possible. And then one weekend around the age of 14, I got sent to like this continuing education class at a local community college. And I had this opportunity to see Master Chef Ed Janos prepare a roasted chicken with mashed potatoes, pan gravy, and green beans. And it's funny because his roasted chicken was really absolutely amazing. And although I'd had roasted chicken many times before, they were never quite as good as this. This thing was brined, roasted perfectly, rested beautifully. Mashed potatoes were smooth and creamy and, like 30% butter and 30% cream. They were really absolutely amazing, especially at the time because I grew up with lumpy mashed potatoes. That was what I thought mashed potatoes were supposed to be. And really like a legitimate pan gravy, brown, beautiful, delicious, tasty. And within a few weeks, I had decided that I wanted to become a certified master chef. I wanted to be like Ed Janos. And that was really the beginning for me of a sight, a vision of what I wanted the future to hold. Now, I had many first drafts between that starting point and where I ended up a few years ago. and I'm far from done, but that was my fairly humble beginning. I grew up very humbly. You can come from anywhere. And along the way, I had many people tell me that there were a lot of things that I couldn't do. I remember a conversation with my dad. My dad, he told me that no son of his was ever going to grow up to be a dumb cook. And you know, your brain does funny things to you. And in the beginning, I looked at it as like, well, what does he know? Not all cooks are dumb. And I guess about a year or so later, I was able to kind of rework that in a way to say, you know what, I'm going to show him that I'm not going to grow up to be a dumb cook. I'm not going to let anybody else's limitations impact what I can do in this field. And so that was really yet another step that solidified me on that path to becoming a certified master chef. And that really kept me on my path. It kept me pushing, it kept me learning, it kept me growing. It was the thing that really kept me on my path more than anything else. It was the idea that my end goal was to master the craft of cooking. And having that end goal in mind allowed me to create a filter for every activity, every job, every competition, everything I did. It's actually where I first started creating filters for my life. The filter was, is this going to get me a step closer to the Master Chef exam? Is this going to prepare me to be a master of the craft? Is this making me a better cook? Those questions become incredible filters for the decisions that we make. And for me, I needed those questions in order to make sure that I was doing the things that were going to have the greatest impact on my life. Now, if it wasn't getting me closer to my goal, I had to accept the fact that it was getting me further away from my goal. So I had to make sure that everything that I was doing was getting me closer and closer to that end goal. And fast forward to 2014, 2015, as I started getting closer to taking that Master Chef exam, I started to actually think of it as the mindset of mastery. And I called it that in my head because my goal in all things that I did became the intention of mastering them. So every process that I did, every task that I did, every project that I endured on, I wanted to master it because I wanted to become a master of the craft. So that was the mindset of mastery. It was the very idea that I was setting out with the intention to master it. You know, if you look, successful people leave clues on how they reach their success, and this was one of those massive pieces for me. It was keeping the end goal of mastering the craft in my mind. Looking back, I realized that having the mindset of mastery kept me from doing some really dumb things. Dumb, treasonous decisions in behalf of myself. Driving home intoxicated, realizing, sitting in my car and thinking, wow, this could really, if I get arrested tonight, that could really put a damper on my future. It's moments like those when you need a higher vision to make good decisions. Haven't always made great decisions, but looking back, I know that mindset took me overseas. That mindset put me at the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston, took me to the Westchester Country Club. It took me to the Everglades Club. Everything I did was intentionally done to get me closer to my ultimate goal. When I say everything, I mean I can look back at this point in my 40s and say everything that I did was intentionally done. And I guess that's inaccurate. There were things that I thought were the right thing to do that weren't. They didn't work out. But knowing that I had my compass point, honing in with the intention of mastering the craft, it allowed me to pick myself back up and get myself on the right path. Falling flat at the Bocuse d'Or tryouts when my main component just completely disintegrated in the fryer, I came back home and I realized, yeah, okay, I learned a ton from this. Now what can I learn? How can I get myself back together? And how can I push myself forward? Focusing on the future without having a goal kind of makes the future seem bleak at times. But always having had that end in mind of mastering the craft, it allowed me to maintain a focus. It allowed me to maintain an intensity, and it allowed me to work more effectively on everything that I was doing. I'm not talking about mastery over anyone else or being better than anybody. I'm talking about mastery of myself and my faculties. I'm talking about mastering my own world, taking responsibility and making the decisions that I need to make in order to have the most effective result that I'm working towards. If you think about it, if you step back, there's only two worlds that we really have to manage, right? We have the world outside of us, and we have the world that lives inside of us. The world that's outside of us is always changing, and if we're always looking to the outside for what we're supposed to do, we're always going to be reacting to what the outside world gives us. If you're focusing on the world that's within you, if you have a main objective in your mind and in your heart, you can control that inside world, make your decisions based on what you need in your inside world, and that modifies the outside world. It helps align the outside world to more effectively get you where you need to go. Taking control of that internal space keeps you from being so reactive, can allow you to work more reflectively. We can learn all sorts of different things, but if you're not actively engaged in pursuing your path, then you're not going to really get there. I love the idea of mastery because mastery doesn't come from passively learning. Mastery comes from actively pursuing, being curious, being passionate, and finding that next step that you need to make in order to master the craft. And it means something different to everybody. But I know internally, for me, what that meant. Quite honestly, the big aha moment was a big major click when I realized that, to me, mastery means that the more I learn, the more I recognize I don't know. There is a world full of knowledge, and I have a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of practical knowledge. I've applied tons of it. But there's so much more for me to learn, and that's a beautiful thing. That actually energizes me and excites me. And looking back, it excited me for a very long time as well. It overwhelmed me for little periods here and there, but it's that passion and interest that really fueled my fire. It was that mindset, that mastery mindset, that drove me into so many of the situations that I am completely grateful for. Learning how to hold myself accountable and making sure that the activities that I was doing was getting me closer to those goals. If you step back and you look, everybody has two choices, regardless of whether you're looking at the outside world or the inside world, and you can choose from one or the other. You can choose the pain of discipline, or you can choose the pain of regret. The pain of discipline goes in line with recognizing that you can control your inside world, and suffering in the short term to do the things that are a little bit harder, a little more challenging, a little more uncomfortable, lead you to an external world that helps you get what you need. The pain of regret comes when you're pushing aside those things that you don't want to do short term And it forces you to deal with whatever the outside world hands you. If you think about any great sports figure, you can tell the ones that were the most successful were the ones that suffered the most discipline. The ones who spent the most time in the gym training as hard as humanly possible to get as far as humanly possible, shot after shot, time after time. And that's where their success came from. That's what made them greats. That's what made Jordan a great. Jordan, thousands of shots. It was 1,000 shots every day that he needed to make in order for him to finish training for the day. It was that standard that allowed him to be one of the greatest of all times. It's that attitude towards discipline that leads down that path towards mastery. And that mindset of mastery requires that commitment to discipline in order to get there. Actively pursuing that. Some people think that, you can take the path of inaction to avoid feeling either discipline or regret. But usually, at some point, that leads to more suffering than anything else. So don't let inaction stop you from getting where you want to go. Don't let your comfort zone stop you from getting into your first draft. And keep that end goal in mind. Keep that mindset of mastery focused to the end of whatever it is. Whatever it is that you're trying to pursue, just make it great and make it matter to you. Make sure it maintains purpose. So I wanted to share a couple of the things that I learned along the way, along my path to mastery. And, there's really 5 really common mistakes that I committed when I was a young cook and when I was getting ready for the exam or for tryouts. And this is something that I see from students, from clients and competitors. And I thought this was a good opportunity to kind of drop these 5 little common things in here that you can incorporate to avoid, but make the biggest difference from a craftsman standpoint, right? First things first, value fundamentals over art. As a young cook, I loved the idea of things being beautiful. I didn't necessarily understand the true value of great fundamentals. The second one is to make sure that you're developing flavor. Remember that cooking is a craft first. Most points in anything, be it certification, be it competition, any environment you go into, those most points are going to come from flavor. So remember that developing flavor is your best path forward. And if you're looking for some tips on developing flavor, I suggest you pick up a classical cookbook. Le Guide Culinaire is phenomenal for talking about developing flavor, getting layers, going through the process of building beautiful stocks into beautiful reductions, into great essences, and layering those flavors. Economically, it may be a little bit more expensive, but when you cook great food, people will pay for it. That's why flavor development is so necessary. People talk to me about competition as being irrelevant or certification as being irrelevant, and I couldn't disagree more, because I believe that competition makes you a better chef, it makes you a better craftsman, it allows you to operate better in your food service operation, it makes you a better teacher, it allows you to serve better food. So make sure that you're developing flavor. Number 3, master the basics to the highest of your ability. Think of the most simple components and recognize that there is room to master simplicity. Chef Arnaud's going to talk quite a bit about that. I don't want to steal his thunder, but think about it. Hot food should be hot, cold food should be cold. We're all taught that at an early point in our career. How often do we follow it? Do we pass those lessons on? I don't know, I find myself going out to eat and I think we live in a world of warm. And I'm really tired of warm food. One of the worst meals I had in my life was at the Fat Duck. The Fat Duck was completely lukewarm, and in all fairness, we're going back now, 16 years ago? It's a long time. but it was a warm, mushy meal, and it was the least enjoyable meal that I've ever spent a month and a half's rent on. That was probably the hardest part of it. But remember, basics. It's those basics. If it's easy to do, it's easy not to do. So make sure that you're doing the basics and helping people understand the relevance of doing the basics. Make sure that you're using the right tool for the job. That's number 4. That's one of the 4th most common mistakes that I see, everywhere. And again, guilty. I'll never forget Chef Arnone letting me know that I could use a smaller pan to braise a piece of meat in, especially because I was braising a single rabbit thigh. Never thought of braising in a 6th pan before. There were other people who said you should never braise in a 6th pan, but when you don't have another pot that's quite that small, it's the right size pan. So looking at your surroundings, make sure that you're using the right tool for the job. As younger cooks, I know that it was beaten into our heads, and if we're not teaching that to the next layer, to the next level, to the next generation of cooks, that's a lesson that they're not going to have, they're not going to be able to work forward with, right? So make sure that people are using the proper knife for the proper thing. A cleaver is used as a cleaver should be, right? Boning knives have uses, slicers have uses. Cook in the appropriate size pans. And another shockingly simple thing that everybody can do to improve their food, and something that, yes, I guess I took for granted for myself too, is taste your food. That is an incredibly relevant point, and it really is those 5 simple things that contribute greatly to mastery. Now I want to think quickly, because Chef Andrini earlier today talked a little bit about his apprenticeship. And I think what's important to know here is that every great chef, every great athlete, every great musician, whether intentionally or not, went through an apprenticeship. And if you have that intention to master something, you kind of have to transition through 8 simple phases, right? Those 8 simple phases are: first, value learning over money. That talented young chef who takes a lead chef role early and maxes out their ceiling very quickly isn't going to be able to rebound so well, right? Think value in the marketplace. The value in your marketplace comes from learning to do the job better, and it's a lot easier as a young cook to learn how to wash dishes and learn how to saute than it is as an executive sous chef who didn't learn how to cook saute so well. It's really hard to go back. Keep growing. Principle number 2. Growth isn't found in the comfort zone, so make sure that as you're transitioning through your career, you're in roles that are making you feel that pressure. And that pressure is going to push you to learn and gain that value, to learn more. Number 3, maintain a sense of curiosity over your years. And this is, I think, something that's even more important to me at this stage in my life than maybe it's ever been, right? There's, I guess, a tendency as you start to get a little bit older to lose that curiosity to, maybe it is, I don't know. But for me, this is something that excites me more than anything, is continuously being curious about food. That was something that served me really well as a young cook, wanting to run home after learning something and read about it and dig into a book or do some research online. So maintain curiosity. Encourage younger cooks to maintain curiosity. Think about playing with a kid, and think about, the curiosity that a kid always has with no concern about failure. This is a great way to balance out that concern over that first draft. Remember to trust that there's a process. On the path through your career and on the path through my career, there is a process. Whether it all makes sense or not, there is a process that we will all go through. And if you're working for well-respected, well-talented professionals along the way, there's going to be a process that presents itself. And I think as time goes on, we're getting more clear as to what that process can be. Remember to move in the direction of struggle, and remember or know that you can make the most of failure. Learn from failure. While you're going through your apprenticeship, you need to understand that you are going to make mistakes. Just make sure you learn from them and try not to make the same ones again. That's a lesson that served me really well as I was getting ready for the Olympic team. Beyond that, learn how to combine the how and the why of what we're doing. We learn that in our apprenticeship, but we don't necessarily process it until a little bit later on in life. This is one that I really was talking with, Chef Andrini about earlier today. So if you have the ability to go back and rewatch, feel free to dive into it. But think about how important it is for people to understand the why with what they're doing. When I have young cooks who don't want to skim a stock, I realize that it's because they don't understand the why. They don't understand the point of what it means to have a great stock. Why it's that way doesn't really matter. Why they don't know that is not my concern. I just know that they need to learn it. And then finally, for an effective apprenticeship to happen, you have to learn how to develop through trial and error. And I think as an executive chef later on in your career, this is one of those things that serves us really well. It's hard. It's hard to have trial and error. It's hard to fail. It's hard to look foolish. But it's even more important as you get older. Beyond that apprenticeship, we spend time in a journey phase, and we kind of have to re-spark that mindset of mastery, rekindle our purpose. Otherwise, we get too comfortable. We have more than we've ever had before. And now we're at a point where we just need to rekindle those things that we want, those things that we're aiming for, and make sure that we don't settle too early, because once we settle and we get cozy for a little while, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we're probably going to have to re-spark and reignite that in the future. Or we find ourselves having missed a boat maybe. So once you get cozy, use that as an opportunity to look and see maybe what lies ahead. It's tough because I know in the world that we live in, chefs are looking for a bit of balance. I haven't talked to a chef in a very long time who's not looking for some sense of balance in their life, but I think it's really difficult to find balance when you're spending 10, 12 hours a day at a job, at a work. As long as there's purpose to it, it makes it a little bit easier. But then how do you leave that environment and head home and find balance? There's no way to achieve anything great without really exercising some significant effort and then counterbalancing that significant effort. Gary Keller, in a book called The One Thing, talks about this really perfectly. And I think his writing really hit home with me. It's important to make sure that we go periods of time where we're hyper-focused on accomplishing a thing and making sure that we're counterbalancing in our personal lives as well, to make sure that our personal lives are maintained. At the same time, once that thing gets done, that we need to make sure that we counterbalance and we focus that same time and energy where it matters with our family and in our personal lives. If you're constantly looking for balance on the day-to-day, I think you really struggle to make any great big movements happen. Nothing wrong with going all out for a season, but that needs to be coupled with an off season. There needs to be an opportunity there to allow some room for recharge, to allow us to be great humans, and to encourage people to want to be around us in our life outside of what we normally do on the day-to-day. Like I said, I think it's really hard to maintain balance all the time. I love the work that I do. The fact that I maintain a ton of purpose in my work allows me to do this, allows me to do it for as long as possible. And quite honestly, I know there are nights when I would take 30-minute naps while I was getting ready for Team USA, and I was rather content, tired, but I was excited about getting back into the kitchen to work on a piece. I think it's important that if you have that passion and that curiosity, that you not stunt it, but at the same time recognize that that is also straining something else. So when the opportunity comes to find that counterbalance, to be able to repay the support systems that support you in those times, that you do. I had a chef at a younger point in my life, talk to me about the idea of the emotional bank accounts. And quite simply, just make sure that I'm not always making a withdrawal from that emotional bank account and trying to add and make the most of people's lives. So take pride in your first draft. Recognize that it is all a part of a process. There's really 4 principal skills that you're going to learn through your process. And I think if you can call out those principal skills, you can recognize the steps that you've made in your career, and you can take the best lessons from them. I think it's really important to be able to self-assess, to strategize, make sure that you take some time to integrate what you learn, and then reflect. If you do that with your first draft, then your first draft will always mean something greater. Love the idea of starting off with the first draft because it's a clean start. It's a clean slate. It's never, ever clean after that, ever. But it's a beautiful place to start. And as long as you recognize that that first draft is probably going to suck, you can also recognize that that first draft is the key to maintaining an intention of the highest level that you can hold for it. For me, that mindset of mastery was something that pushed me to take every first draft, figure out if I had to scrap it and turn it into something completely different, or if it was something that I could evolve along the ways, reiterate, and turn into something that was really something great. I think that was the key to me learning my way along. It was a really great, powerful starting point for me to be able to interact with my mentors along the way, who also nudged me to do that. I can't claim these ideas for my own. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. I've put thoughts together from various mentors, from various instructors, from people over the years to get to where I am. So don't think for a second that I'm trying to claim that all of these ideas are my own, but they're things that I've put together, and these are the things that have served me the best over my time. Remember that change is going to happen whether you want it to or not. And I would encourage you to test your comfort zones, test your new first draft, and keep pushing to create what you're looking for. Keep testing yourself, and it'll allow you to take a lot more responsibility over what's going on around you. It'll allow you to have control over the world that you need. It's really important that we as chefs try. And sometimes it's hard because sometimes that trying leads us nowhere, and it makes us feel like it leads us nowhere. But just trying has amazing impact on all the people that are around us. And if you're a champion for this industry the way that I am, if you're a champion for this industry like I'm sure you are, the industry needs champions and people who love it, who can share the best lessons that there are to learn, especially with the new generation. That's what I'm here to do, and that's why I'm sharing this with you. So for me, I know that, high performance chefs aren't born, they're trained. And that's why I do what I do. I want to share my ideas. I want to help you understand where I'm at, what it is that I'm working on. I want you to understand that this work that I do is really relevant and be able to incorporate it into who you are, into what you do every single day. We all update our hardware, we all update our phones, we all update our knives, our tools. But just like our devices, our operating systems need an upgrade too. When was your last upgrade? For me, these are upgrades. For me, learning these lessons, picking up a book, meditating, listening to Rick Ladendorf and Craig Marshall, the monk and the mastermind today, is a great upgrade to help me understand new things. So for me, I've taken this and I've created something entirely new as well. I'll follow up with an email. I don't want to tell you too much about it right now, but these lessons are built into a program for you to explore deeper. And I'll be opening up an information session about that on Tuesday, February 15th. I'll send you an email. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being able to spend the time with me today. I'm going to open up, take a look and see if there's any questions. If the chat's causing trouble like it was earlier, I won't be able to. And then we're going to line up for Paul and Chrissy Jensen. I appreciate you listening. I'm really excited to have shared this with you. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the evening. Talk to you in a few minutes.